The thing that keeps replaying in my head isn't the shouting, or the crying, or even the look on her face when she realized I wasn't going to talk it out like some couples therapy brochure. It's the sound of my best friend's laugh, this familiar, easy laugh I've heard since we were 10 years old, coming from somewhere it had absolutely no business being, bleeding through the hallway like a joke I wasn't in on, while I stood in my own doorway with grocery bags cutting into my hands and my brain stalling out like an engine that just threw a rod. I didn't kick the door in or scream his name like some movie scene, because my body didn't do anything heroic, it just went cold and still, and I remember thinking, stupidly, that I must have misheard it, that maybe the TV was on, or Aaron had a podcast playing, or maybe my mind was just tired from another week of 12-hour shifts and I was hearing things. Then I took one more step, and the floorboard I'd always meant to fix squeaked, and the laughter stopped so fast it was like someone hit mute on my life. I stood there with a carton of eggs and a rotisserie chicken, listening to silence in the house I'd paid for, in the life I thought I'd built, and I realized in this sharp, nauseating way that the worst part wasn't going to be what I saw next, it was going to be how quickly my brain started inventorying details like a detective instead of a husband, because some part of me already knew the truth and wanted proof so badly it was willing to break me to get it. I'm Jake, 36, born and raised in western Pennsylvania, the kind of guy who still calls a shopping cart a buggy, because that's what my dad called it, and I've lived in the same Pittsburgh area orbit my whole life even when I swore at 18 that I'd move somewhere warm and reinvent myself. I work as a project manager for a small commercial construction outfit, which sounds fancier than it is, because most days I'm juggling subcontractors who don't show up, clients who want miracles on a beer budget, and a boss who thinks stress is a personality trait. Aaron is 34 and works in HR for a healthcare network, the kind of job that makes you good at reading people but also makes you tired of people in a way that seeps into the rest of your life. We'd been together 8 years, married for 5, no kids yet, mostly because we kept telling ourselves we'd wait until things settled down, and somehow life just kept moving the goalposts while we pretended we were in control of the schedule. We weren't some Instagram perfect couple, but we weren't a disaster either, at least that's what I believed. We had routines that felt like stability. Sunday morning coffee on the back step even in the winter with blankets around our shoulders, trivia nights at a little bar in Millvale where the bartender knew Aaron's order before she sat down, my habit of leaving my work boots by the door even though she hated it, her habit of stealing my hoodies and acting offended when I asked for them back. My best friend Matt was woven into all of that, because he wasn't just a friend, he was family in the way only childhood friendships can be, the kind where you've seen each other's parents age, you've been to each other's graduations, you've helped each other move apartments at midnight, you've sat on tailgates in parking lots eating gas station food and talking about nothing and everything. Aaron liked Matt, and not in a forced way either, because he was charming and loud and always ready with some story about some stupid thing we did as teenagers, and she'd laugh and squeeze my knee like she was happy she got to be part of my history. The trouble didn't start like a lightning strike, it started like weather, slow and creeping, and at first I told myself it was normal adult stress. Aaron got quieter in the evenings, not sad exactly, just elsewhere. She'd sit on the couch with her phone angled slightly away like she was shielding it from the room, and if I asked what she was looking at she'd say, nothing, in a tone that made it clear I should drop it, which I usually did because I was exhausted and conflict felt like another job. She started going for walks after dinner, sometimes for 40 minutes, sometimes an hour, and I didn't think much of it because she'd been trying to be healthier, but the walks always seemed to happen when I finally had time to sit down and be present, and I'd watch the door close behind her and feel this petty sting like I was being scheduled around. When I reached for her in bed, she'd shift or sigh or say she was tired, and the rejection wasn't dramatic, it was casual, which somehow made it worse because it felt like the intimacy between us had become an inconvenience. Matt, meanwhile, was around more than usual, and that was the part that should have set off alarms but didn't, because how do you suspect the person you've trusted since you were kids without feeling like you're betraying your own life? Matt had broken up with his girlfriend, again, and he'd been showing up at my house with six-packs and bad jokes, acting like he needed company, and I'd be grateful because he was a distraction from work and Aaron's distance. Aaron would actually perk up when Matt arrived, and I remember thinking it was nice to see her laugh again, because I was so desperate for proof that we were still us that I treated her happiness like a win even when it wasn't coming from me. There were other little things, too, the kind of stuff you only connect later when your brain starts rewinding your life like game film. Erin started dressing nicer for mundane errands, like she was going to run to Target but came down the stairs wearing makeup she usually saved for date nights, and if I complimented her she'd smile but it wouldn't reach her eyes the way it used to. She started keeping her phone on her at all times, even bringing it into the bathroom, and if it buzzed at night she'd flip it face down with this quick, almost reflexive motion. I noticed, and every time I noticed I immediately told myself I was being paranoid, because the alternative was that my marriage was cracking and I was too clueless to see it until it fell on my head. The first time I really felt something shift was at a cookout at our place in early summer, one of those humid Pittsburgh evenings where the sky looks bruised and the air feels like a wet towel. Matt was in the backyard with me, flipping burgers, and Erin came out with a bowl of pasta salad and bumped into him by accident, except it didn't look like an accident, because their bodies moved like they already knew where the other one was. Matt said something low, Erin laughed, and when she walked away she touched his arm, a brief little brush of fingers, and I remember staring at that spot on his forearm like it was evidence of a crime. When I asked Erin later what that was about, she rolled her eyes and told me I was reading into everything, and then she softened and kissed my cheek like she was doing damage control, and I let myself be soothed because I didn't want to be the guy who accuses his wife of something awful based on a touch. Still, the feeling stayed. The feeling that I was standing at the edge of something I didn't understand, watching my own life move without me. The day it happened was a Thursday, and the only reason I came home early was because a concrete pour got pushed due to weather and my boss told me to take the rest of the afternoon instead of pretending to be busy in the office. It should have been a gift, one of those rare pockets of time where you can surprise your spouse with something small and normal, like picking up dinner or sitting together before the day ends. I even remember thinking, driving home, that maybe Erin and I could reset, because lately everything felt like we were living parallel lives in the same house, and I was tired of feeling like I had to earn my own wife's attention. I stopped at Giant Eagle and grabbed groceries, stuff Erin had texted me earlier in the week, plus a cheap bottle of red wine because I thought it might make the evening feel like a date even if it was just us eating chicken at the kitchen table. I pulled into the driveway, saw Erin's car there like usual, and I remember being relieved because a part of me had been worrying she was out again, walking or running errands, or whatever she called it. The house looked normal from the outside, quiet, curtains half open, nothing dramatic, and that's the sick thing about betrayal, how ordinary the setting can be while your whole world is about to split. When I opened the door, I didn't hear the TV. I didn't hear the dishwasher. I didn't hear Erin humming the way she sometimes did when she was in a good mood. I heard a laugh, muffled but unmistakable, and my body reacted before my mind did, because my stomach dropped and my hands went numb and the grocery bags suddenly felt heavier. I stepped into the foyer and I saw two things immediately: Erin's shoes kicked off in the middle of the hallway like she'd been in a hurry, and a second pair of shoes next to them that didn't belong to me. They were Matt's, because I knew Matt's shoes the way you know someone's handwriting, and in the same instant I knew the laugh had been his and the sound had been coming from down the hall toward our bedroom. I wish I could say I ran. I didn't. I moved like I was underwater, slow and stiff, and I set the groceries down on the little table by the stairs because my hands were shaking too hard to hold them. The house smelled faintly like Erin's vanilla candle, the one she always lit when she cleaned, which would have been comforting on any other day, but in that moment it felt like a mask over something rotten. I took one step toward the hallway, and the floorboard near the bathroom squeaked, and then everything went quiet, which was worse than the laugh because silence meant they heard me, and it meant whatever was happening was real enough to stop. I don't know what I expected when I reached the bedroom door, because the truth is I'd already built the scene in my head and my mind just wanted to confirm the details. The door was mostly closed, not latched, just pulled in like someone thought it was enough to create privacy, and there was a sliver of light from the bedside lamp. I pushed it open, and the sight that hit me didn't feel like shock, it felt like a punch that landed clean and hard. Erin was on the bed, hair messy, face flushed, eyes wide like a deer in headlights, and Matt was there too, scrambling like he'd been caught stealing instead of destroying a life. They were half-dressed in that chaotic way that tells you everything without needing to see explicit details, and Matt's voice came out first, too fast, too loud, too desperate, because he launched into this rambling, panicked explanation about how it wasn't what it looked like, which is maybe the dumbest sentence a person can say when it looks exactly like what it is. Erin didn't speak at first, she just stared at me, and I remember thinking that she looked angry, not guilty, which felt like a second betrayal stacked on top of the first. My throat didn't work right away, because I wanted to scream and I wanted to vomit and I wanted to rewind time, but all that came out was this broken, flat question I didn't recognize as my own voice. "How long?" I asked, and it wasn't even a full sentence, just 2 words that carried all the weight of our marriage. Matt tried to talk over Erin, and Erin tried to talk over Matt, and the noise turned into this frantic, overlapping mess like they thought if they filled the air with enough words I wouldn't be able to think. I held my hand up, not in a dramatic way, but like a traffic cop, because I couldn't take it, and I said, slowly, "Stop," and the fact that they listened made me feel even more disgusted, because it meant they still saw me as someone they had to manage. Erin finally found her voice and she said my name like I was the one who'd done something wrong, like I was interrupting, and she started crying immediately, but her crying didn't read as remorse, it read as fear of consequences. Matt sat on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands, and I remember this insane detail, that he had a tan line where his wedding ring used to be from his last engagement, and my brain latched onto it like it mattered, because my mind was trying to cope by noticing anything except the fact that my wife and my best friend had crossed a line you can't uncross. I didn't start yelling right away, and I think that confused them, because Erin kept waiting for me to explode, and Matt kept flinching like he expected me to hit him, which, for the record, I didn't, not because I'm some saint but because I was too stunned and because violence felt like a way to make this about me being out of control, instead of them being disloyal. I stood in the doorway and I remember gripping the doorframe so hard my fingers hurt, because I needed something solid to hold onto while my life turned liquid. Erin started with excuses that sounded like they'd been practiced, which is something I didn't realize until later, when I replayed her words and heard how smooth they were. She said she'd been lonely, that I'd been checked out, that my job came first, that she tried to tell me she needed more and I never listened, and every time she said something like that it felt like she was stacking blame on me to build herself a bridge out of guilt. Matt chimed in with his own version, talking about how Erin had been having a hard time, how he was just trying to be there for her, how things got out of hand, and it was almost impressive how both of them tried to frame this as an accident, like they slipped and fell into betrayal. The thing that finally cracked something in me was when Erin said, through tears, "It just happened," because I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw that she wasn't talking about one bad decision, she was talking about a series of choices that had required planning, secrecy, and comfort with lying to my face. I asked her, again, how long, and this time my voice was steadier, which made me feel weirdly powerful and nauseated at the same time. Erin hesitated, and Matt looked at her like he was begging her not to say it, and that hesitation was an answer all by itself, because people don't hesitate when the truth is small. Erin finally whispered, "A few months," and the words landed like a blunt object, because a few months meant countless days where she'd kissed me goodbye, sat across from me at dinner, laughed at my jokes, texted me heart emojis, all while carrying this secret like it was normal. I asked Erin if she'd been in my house with him before, and she tried to deny it at first, but denial doesn't work when the evidence is standing there with his shoes in the hallway. Matt started talking again, saying he could explain, saying he never meant to hurt me, saying I was his brother, and I remember this surge of rage so hot it made my vision narrow, because you don't call someone your brother while you're doing something that would break them. I told him, in this low voice that didn't even sound angry but absolutely was, that brothers don't do this, and the look on his face, this mixture of shame and self-pity, made me want to laugh and scream at the same time. Erin kept trying to pull me into a discussion like it was a marital argument we could solve if we communicated better, and she kept saying things like, "Let's talk," and, "Please don't do something rash," and the most surreal part was that she said it while sitting on the bed where she'd just betrayed me, like she still believed she had authority over how I reacted. When I told her I was done, that I was not going to sit there and negotiate with someone who'd been lying to me for months, she snapped, just for a second, and she said, "So you're just going to throw everything away," and that sentence rewired something in my head because it revealed how she saw this, as if I was the one destroying the marriage by refusing to accept being betrayed. Matt stood up and tried to come toward me, and I stepped back instinctively, not because I was scared he'd hit me, but because I didn't want him close enough to touch me, because touch felt contaminated now. I told him to leave, and he started crying, which I didn't expect, because Matt had always been the guy who made jokes when life got hard, and seeing him cry should have made me feel something like nostalgia or sympathy, but all I felt was this ugly disgust, like I was watching someone perform emotion to avoid accountability. Erin begged me not to call anyone, and that's when I realized she wasn't begging for the marriage, she was begging for her image. She didn't want people to know what she'd done, she didn't want her parents to know, she didn't want our friends to know, and that told me more than any confession could have, because if she'd truly been remorseful, her first instinct would have been to own it, not hide it. When I told Erin I was calling my brother to come over, because I didn't trust myself to be alone with them, she panicked and said, "Jake, please," and reached for me with this trembling hand like she could physically pull me back into the old reality, and I stepped away and said, "Don't touch me," and the way she recoiled at that made me realize how much she'd taken my presence for granted, how she assumed I'd always be there to absorb whatever she did. After Matt left, because I basically stood there like a bouncer until he grabbed his shoes and stumbled out, Erin tried to follow him into the hallway, and I told her to stay in the bedroom, and she did, because for the first time in months she seemed to understand I wasn't asking. I walked into the kitchen and stared at the groceries on the table like they belonged to someone else's life, like I'd accidentally wandered into the wrong house, and then I did this humiliating thing where I slid down the cabinet and sat on the floor because my legs wouldn't hold me up anymore. I didn't cry at first. I sat there shaking, feeling this buzzing in my skin like my nervous system didn't know what to do with itself, and my mind started jumping between memories, flipping through years like they were photos on a phone, except now every happy moment had this shadow on it because I didn't know what was real anymore. I thought about Erin laughing at our wedding, Erin asleep on my shoulder on a road trip, Erin crying when our dog died, Erin telling me she loved me on a random Tuesday, and all of it started to feel suspect, like maybe I'd been the only one in the marriage who believed in it. The rage came in waves, not a steady burn but these sudden surges where my heart would pound and my hands would clench and I'd have to breathe through it like I was trying not to drown. I wanted to call Matt and scream until my voice gave out, I wanted to drive to his place and drag him outside so everyone could see what he'd done, I wanted to break something just to make the inside of me match the outside, and at the same time I felt this crushing sadness because part of me still loved Erin, or maybe loved who I thought Erin was, and losing that felt like grief, the kind you can't explain to people who haven't been there. Erin came into the kitchen at some point wrapped in a blanket like she was the victim of a tragedy instead of the cause, and she sat at the table and cried and kept saying she was sorry, but every apology sounded like it had a condition attached, like she was sorry I found out, sorry this was happening, sorry I was upset, and I couldn't take it. I asked her, quietly, if she would have told me if I hadn't walked in, and she didn't answer right away, and that pause again said everything, because remorse doesn't hesitate when faced with the truth. I remember standing up and looking at her, this woman I'd planned a future with, and feeling something inside me go flat, like a switch had flipped from love to self-preservation. I told her I was leaving the house for the night, because I couldn't breathe in the same space as her, and she freaked out, asking where I was going, accusing me of abandoning her, and the audacity of that nearly made me laugh, because she'd abandoned me long before I walked through that door. The weirdest part was the physical side of it, the way betrayal doesn't just hurt emotionally, it rewires your body. I couldn't eat. My mouth felt dry no matter how much water I drank. My chest felt tight, like I was constantly bracing for impact. Every time my phone buzzed I flinched, because I didn't know if it would be Erin begging, Matt apologizing, or someone else unknowingly stepping into the blast radius of my imploding life. I drove to my brother's house across town and sat on his porch while he listened, and the words came out of me in this ugly rush, and when I finally said, it was Matt, my brother's face changed in a way I'll never forget, because even he, who didn't have the childhood history, understood instantly how deep that cut went. That night I didn't sleep, not really. I stared at the ceiling in my brother's guest room and kept seeing the bedroom door, kept hearing that laugh, kept replaying Erin's excuses, and I realized something terrifying. I wasn't just losing my wife, I was losing my best friend, and I was losing the version of myself who believed people close to him wouldn't do this. There's a kind of innocence you don't realize you have until it's ripped away, and I felt it leaving me, leaving behind someone harder, colder, and much less willing to ignore red flags just because ignoring them is easier. By morning, the shock had settled into something sharper, a clarity that felt brutal but oddly steady, like the fog had burned off and revealed a landscape I didn't want but could finally see. Aaron had sent me dozens of texts overnight, everything from apologies to anger to pleading, and reading them felt like watching someone try every tool in the box to regain control. She told me she loved me. She told me it didn't mean anything. She told me she'd been unhappy. She told me I was her person. She told me I was overreacting. Every message contradicted the one before it, and instead of making me feel pulled back toward her, it made me realize she wasn't grounded in truth, she was grounded in whatever argument might keep me from leaving. I went back to the house mid-morning with my brother, because I didn't trust the situation and because I needed someone with me who would keep me from getting sucked into Erin's emotional hurricane. Erin was waiting in the living room like she'd been pacing for hours, eyes swollen, hair pulled back messily, wearing the sweatshirt I'd bought her at a Steelers game, and seeing my sweatshirt on her body made me irrationally furious because it felt like she was using my comfort as armor. She started crying again when she saw me, and she stepped toward me like she was going to hug me, and I put my hand up and told her, again, not to touch me, and this time my voice didn't shake. I told her I wanted space, that I was not going to have a long conversation right then, that I was going to pack some things and stay elsewhere while I figured out what came next. She tried to argue, tried to say we should see a counselor, tried to say we owed it to our marriage to try, and the word owed hit me like an insult, because she was talking about obligation while ignoring the fact that she'd already defaulted on every vow that mattered. My brother stood quietly in the corner, arms crossed, not saying much, but his presence was like a wall behind me, something solid that kept me from being pushed backward by guilt. When Erin finally said, "So what, you're just leaving me," I looked at her and I said something that surprised even me with how calm it sounded, because it felt less like anger and more like a statement of fact. I said, "You left me months ago, Erin, you just didn't have the decency to tell me until I caught you," and she made this choking sound like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the angle. Then she did what I didn't expect, which was that she tried to shift the focus onto Matt, insisting he'd pursued her, insisting he'd taken advantage of her emotions, insisting she'd been vulnerable, and I felt this fresh wave of disgust because even now she was trying to paint herself as acted upon, not acting. I told her I didn't care whose idea it was, because it happened, and it kept happening, and the fact that it involved Matt wasn't just an extra betrayal, it was proof that she didn't respect boundaries at all. I watched her face when I said Matt's name, and I saw something flicker there, fear, guilt, maybe even something like longing, and that flicker was enough to convince me there was no repairing this, because the problem wasn't a mistake, the problem was that she'd built a secret life and felt entitled to it. So I packed a bag, not everything, just enough to get out, because I couldn't stand the idea of staying under the same roof while she tried to talk me into forgiving what I hadn't even finished processing. I took my work laptop, a few changes of clothes, my toiletry bag, and the framed photo on my nightstand of Erin and me at Ohiopile, smiling like idiots in the sun, and I set the photo face down in a drawer because I couldn't throw it away yet, but I couldn't look at it either. Erin followed me from room to room crying, and at one point she dropped to her knees in the hallway and begged me, and if you've never had someone beg you like that, you might think it would soften you, but all it did was make me feel hollow, because the begging didn't erase the months of lying, and it didn't erase the sound of Matt laughing in my house. Before I left, I told her two things, and I meant them with every ounce of whatever was left of me. I told her that I was going to talk to a lawyer, and I told her that she needed to tell her family the truth, because I wasn't going to be the bad guy in the story she was about to spin. She looked at me like I'd slapped her, because image mattered to her, and I realized in that moment that the next phase wasn't going to be just grief, it was going to be conflict, because people who care about appearances will scorch the earth to protect them. I walked out of the house with my brother behind me, and Erin sobbing followed us to the driveway, and I got into the car and sat there gripping the steering wheel, feeling like I was driving away from my whole life. And as I backed out, I caught a glimpse of the hallway window and saw her standing there alone, small and shaking, and a part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but another part of me, the part that had finally woken up, kept repeating the same hard truth: she wasn't alone because I abandoned her, she was alone because she set fire to the bridge and then acted surprised when it collapsed. I'm not at the "everything is okay" part yet, not in this first stretch of it, because right now I'm still living in the immediate aftermath, where every hour feels like a new realization and every realization feels like a punch. But I've already learned something I wish I didn't have to learn, and it's this: when someone shows you that they're capable of betraying you while looking you in the eye, the betrayal isn't just the act, it's the way they rewrite reality to make themselves the hero and you the obstacle. I always thought infidelity was about temptation or weakness or some dramatic collapse, but what I saw in my own house was something colder, something that looked like entitlement, like they believed they could take what they wanted and still keep the rest. Right now, all I have is the first decision: leave the house, stop negotiating with someone who already proved they don't respect you, and start protecting what's left of your sanity, and I'm clinging to that decision like a lifeline, because I can feel how easy it would be to get pulled back into the cycle of apologies and excuses and promises. And the scary part is that I know Aaron is already trying to shape the story, and I know Matt is probably doing the same, because people like this don't just betray you, they try to manage the narrative afterward so they can live with themselves. If you're reading this and you're in that early stage where the truth has just detonated your life, I don't have tidy wisdom yet, but I have one piece of advice I'm already sure about: don't let the people who broke your trust also be the ones who define what happens next, because they'll make your pain into a bargaining chip and your dignity into a negotiable item, and you'll wake up one day realizing you stayed in a burning building because the person holding the match promised they'd stop. The first week after I left the house didn't feel like a week at all, because time turned into this sticky, warped thing where I'd blink and it would be 2 a.m. and I'd be sitting on my brother's couch staring at the same wall like it had answers, and then I'd blink again and it would be daylight and my phone would already be full of messages from Erin that swung wildly between weeping apologies, frantic bargaining, and sudden bursts of anger where she'd accuse me of punishing her. As if my refusal to accept betrayal was cruelty instead of self-respect. I kept thinking there would be a moment where my brain caught up and my body stopped feeling like it was vibrating from the inside, but instead I just lived in this constant state of bracing, like I was waiting for another door to open and reveal another awful surprise. And the worst part was how Matt's silence felt louder than Aaron's texts, because he never once called to ask how I was, he never once tried to face me like a man, he just sent one pathetic paragraph the next day about how he was sorry, and how he never meant for this, which read less like remorse and more like a guy trying to put a lid on a boiling pot so he could pretend he hadn't set the stove on fire. My brother, God bless him, handled me the way you handle someone who's been in an accident and doesn't realize how injured they are yet, because he didn't push me to feel better and he didn't offer dumb platitudes, he just kept the fridge stocked, kept a spare blanket on the couch, and kept telling me that anything I felt was normal and that I didn't have to decide my whole future in a single day. Still, I did decide one thing immediately, and that decision became the spine of everything that happened next, because I realized that if I let Aaron and Matt control even 1 inch of the narrative, if I let them paint this as a mistake or a rough patch, I was going to end up carrying shame that didn't belong to me, and I was going to end up negotiating my own dignity like it was some optional add-on to a marriage contract. So on the second day, while my hands were still shaking enough that I could barely hold a coffee cup steady, I called a divorce attorney that a coworker had used years ago, and I sat in a small office that smelled like old carpet and printer toner and I told a stranger the most humiliating story of my life while he nodded like he'd heard it 1,000 times, which in a weird way made me feel less crazy, because it meant this wasn't some unique cosmic punishment, it was something people survive. The attorney didn't promise me revenge or a perfect outcome, and honestly I didn't want him to, because I wasn't looking for a movie ending, I was looking for a clean exit that didn't leave me financially gutted and emotionally chained to a woman who'd already demonstrated she could lie without blinking. He asked practical questions about the house, the accounts, our incomes, and when I told him about the affair, he said, carefully, that while Pennsylvania divorces usually aren't built around fault like some people imagine, the fact that she'd committed adultery could matter in specific ways depending on what she asked for later, and he advised me to document everything and keep communication in writing, which felt cold until I realized cold was exactly what I needed. That night I finally did what Erin had been terrified of from the beginning, and I told people, not in a dramatic social media post or a mass text blast, but in direct, targeted conversations with the people who mattered, because I refused to be the guy who got cheated on and then got painted as the villain when he didn't forgive and forget. I called Erin's parents first, because they'd always been decent to me and I didn't want them to hear a sanitized version from her where she cried and said we grew apart, and her mom answered in this cheerful voice like nothing in the world could be wrong, and I remember swallowing hard and saying, I need to tell you something, and I'm sorry it has to come from me, and then I said it plainly, that Erin had been having an affair and it was with Matt, and the silence that followed was so long I thought the call dropped, until her mom made this small, strangled sound like the air had been punched out of her. Her dad got on the phone, his voice hard and low, and he asked me if I was sure, and I told him I'd walked in on it, and that detail seemed to flip something in him, because he went from disbelief to this controlled, furious sadness that sounded like a man realizing he raised someone capable of doing something cruel, and he kept repeating, Jesus Christ, like he needed the words to fill the space where his respect for his daughter had just collapsed. Erin found out I'd called them almost immediately, because she called me 10 minutes later screaming so loudly I had to pull the phone away from my ear, and she ranted about how I'd humiliated her, and how I had no right to involve her family, and I remember feeling something settle inside me, this quiet certainty that I was dealing with someone who saw consequences as cruelty and truth as betrayal. Because she hadn't even asked if I was okay, she hadn't even acknowledged what she'd done. She was only furious that her carefully managed image was cracking. When she finally paused to inhale, I said, calmly, that I wasn't going to lie for her, that I wasn't going to protect her from the reality she created, and that if she wanted to keep speaking to me she could do it by text about logistics only, and I hung up before she could drag me into another emotional wrestling match where I ended up exhausted and she ended up feeling like she'd made her case. The next fallout was the friend group, which I honestly dreaded more than I expected, because it's one thing to lose your spouse and your best friend, but it's another thing to watch your community pick sides like your pain is a sport. I told two of my closest buddies from work over beers, and one of them stared at me for a long time before he said, dude, Matt has been at your house all the time, and the way he said it made me realize other people had noticed things I'd refused to name, and instead of making me feel validated, it made me feel sick, because it meant I'd been the last person to know my own marriage was rotting. Word traveled fast, because Pittsburgh is a city that feels big until something personal happens, and suddenly everyone is connected by 3 degrees of separation, and within a week I was getting texts from people I hadn't talked to in years, half of them offering sympathy and the other half fishing for details like it was gossip, and I learned quickly who was worth responding to and who deserved silence. Matt, for his part, tried one more time to salvage himself, and it was almost insulting how predictable it was, because he showed up at my brother's house unannounced one afternoon while I was outside taking the trash out, and for a second my body reacted like it used to, like muscle memory, because I'd spent most of my life trusting this guy, and then the reality hit and the anger came up so fast it tasted metallic. He walked toward me with his hands out like he was approaching a skittish animal, and he started talking in this thick, emotional voice, telling me he'd been out of his mind, telling me he hated himself, telling me Erin had been unhappy and he'd been there for her, and the phrase, there for her, made something in me snap because it was so self-righteous, like he wanted credit for comforting my wife while he was destroying me. I told him, in a voice that shook despite my best effort, that he wasn't my friend anymore, that he wasn't welcome near me, that if he didn't leave my brother's property I was calling the police, and he looked at me with this wounded expression like I was being unreasonable, which somehow made me angrier than any insult, because it was proof he still saw himself as the main character and me as an obstacle. Matt tried to pivot, which is what manipulators do when their first angle fails, and he said he wanted to make it right, and he offered to talk to Erin and end things, and I remember laughing, this harsh, humorless sound that startled even me, because the idea that he thought he had the power to end things like he was doing me a favor was so absurd it bordered on delusion. I told him he didn't get to offer me scraps of decency after months of betrayal, I told him he could live with what he'd done without dragging me into his self-pity, and I told him that whatever guilt he was feeling didn't belong to me to soothe. He stood there for another moment, eyes wet, jaw tight, and then he said, "You're throwing everything away, which was the exact same phrasing Aaron had used, and in that second it clicked that they'd probably rehearsed the same script, the same way of framing themselves as tragic and me as stubborn. I stepped closer and told him, quietly, that he threw it away the moment he climbed into my bed, and I watched his face crumple in a way that almost looked real, and then he turned and walked back to his car like a guy leaving a funeral, except he was the one who'd pulled the trigger. While all that was happening, I was also going through the private, humiliating checklist that nobody tells you about, because after infidelity you don't just grieve, you start managing risk like you've been dropped into a crisis you didn't consent to. I scheduled an STI test and sat in a clinic waiting room surrounded by people flipping through magazines, and I felt this hot shame even though I'd done nothing wrong, and I remember thinking how unfair it was that betrayal turns the faithful person into the one who has to deal with consequences. I changed passwords, froze credit, moved half of our joint savings into an account my attorney advised me to open, and I documented everything like I was building a case file on my own marriage, because I'd learned in a matter of days that trust was not only broken, it was dangerous. Erin, meanwhile, started cycling through strategies like she was spinning a wheel, because one day she'd be sobbing and telling me she'd do anything, the next day she'd be cold and threatening to take me for everything, and the day after that she'd be sending me photos of us smiling on vacation with captions like, "Remember this," as if nostalgia was an argument. The most exhausting part was realizing she wasn't only fighting for the marriage, she was fighting for control, and the moment she realized I wasn't returning to the old dynamic where she could steer my emotions, she started escalating. She showed up at my job one afternoon, which is something I still can't believe she did, because she walked into the front office like she belonged there and asked the receptionist to page me, and when I stepped out and saw her standing there with red eyes and a tight smile, I felt this flash of panic, not because I was afraid of her, but because I didn't want my private pain turning into workplace spectacle. She tried to speak softly, like she was being reasonable, and she told me we needed to handle this like adults, and I told her, in the same soft voice, that she needed to leave and communicate through our attorneys, and when she realized I wasn't moving, her composure cracked and she hissed that I was destroying her, right there in front of coworkers who pretended not to listen but absolutely did, and in that moment I saw how quickly she would weaponize embarrassment if it got her leverage. That was the day I stopped thinking of Erin as my wife who made a catastrophic mistake, and started thinking of her as my adversary in a legal and emotional process where I had to protect myself, because love without trust isn't love, it's just attachment to a memory, and memories don't sign divorce papers or split assets fairly. My attorney filed, and when Erin got served she called me screaming again, insisting she thought we were working on it, and I told her she had misunderstood the situation completely, because there was no working on something she'd demolished in secret for months. She tried to demand counseling, and I told her counseling might help her become a better person for her next relationship, but it wasn't going to resurrect ours, and the cruelty of that sentence sat heavy in my chest afterward, because I'd never spoken to her that way, but it was also the first time in weeks I felt like I was standing up straight. The legal process was slow in the way bureaucracy is slow, and that slowness was almost a blessing, because it forced me to live day by day instead of trying to sprint through grief. Erin moved into the guest room at the house, and I stayed at my brother's for a while, then I rented a small apartment in Dormont that smelled like fresh paint and had windows that rattled when buses went by, and I started building a new routine out of necessity. I'd wake up early, run along the sidewalk before work, come home and cook simple meals, and sit with the quiet, because quiet was better than negotiating with someone who betrayed me and still felt entitled to my emotional labor. I started therapy, which I used to think was for people who couldn't handle life, and then I realized that was just pride talking, because infidelity isn't a normal stressor, it's a trauma that hits your identity, your self-worth, your ability to trust your own perception. My therapist didn't tell me to forgive or to rage, she just kept bringing me back to reality, reminding me that Erin's choices were about her character, not my value, and that I didn't have to punish myself by trying to make sense of a senseless betrayal. The strangest part of healing was how it came in small, unglamorous moments, because one day I realized I'd gone 2 hours without thinking about Erin, and that felt like winning a marathon, and another day I realized the tightness in my chest was gone for the first time since I walked into that bedroom, and I sat in my car in a parking lot and cried, not because I missed her, but because I'd been carrying so much tension my body didn't know how to relax. My brother kept inviting me to Sunday dinners, my coworkers started treating me like a human again instead of a fragile object, and slowly the world stopped feeling like it was collapsing, because the truth is life has this brutal persistence, it keeps moving even when you wish it would pause so you can catch your breath. Erin's life, on the other hand, started unraveling in ways I didn't orchestrate and honestly didn't even have to witness closely, because when you build your stability on lies, the truth doesn't just hurt, it detonates. Her parents didn't disown her in some dramatic sense, but they stopped defending her, and that was worse for her because Erin thrived on being seen as the reasonable one, the responsible one, the one who could do no wrong. Her mom called me a few weeks after the filing and said, quietly, that Erin had confessed the affair had started emotionally long before it became physical, and that she'd been leaning on Matt constantly, and her mom sounded exhausted, like she was grieving the daughter she thought she had. Erin's dad, from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, told her he loved her but he couldn't look at her the same way for a while, and I don't think Erin understood how much that would destabilize her, because when your identity is built on being admired, losing admiration feels like losing oxygen. Then there was the HR job, which is where the irony really sharpened, because Erin worked in a field that demands discretion and ethics, and apparently she'd been using work hours to message Matt, and she'd been sloppy enough that someone noticed, and once rumors start in a healthcare network they spread like smoke. I'm not saying she got fired purely because she cheated, because workplaces don't usually care about marital morality, but she did get let go under the broad, corporate language of performance and conduct concerns, and the timing was too close to ignore. When I found out, I didn't feel joy the way people might expect, because I wasn't sitting there cheering for her suffering, but I did feel this grim sense of balance, because she'd spent months choosing instant gratification over long-term stability, and now the long-term consequences were arriving like overdue bills. Matt, of course, didn't become her Prince Charming, because men who betray their friends aren't suddenly loyal partners, and that's the part one think Erin genuinely didn't anticipate, because she had built this fantasy where the affair meant something deeper, where it was proof she deserved more passion or attention, and she probably believed Matt's compliments the way people believe compliments when they're starving for validation. From what trickled back through the grapevine, Erin and Matt tried to be together openly for a few weeks, and it was a disaster almost immediately, because once the secrecy was gone, all they had left was two flawed people staring at each other in daylight, both of them carrying guilt, both of them resenting the other for the fallout. Matt started drinking more, he started missing work, and he started telling people he never asked for this, as if Erin had dragged him into my bed at gunpoint, and Erin started realizing she wasn't the cherished exception in his life, she was just the latest bad decision. There was a moment, about 3 months in, when Erin showed up at my apartment unannounced, and that was the closest I came to losing the progress I'd made, because she stood outside my door in a coat that was too thin for the weather, cheeks blotchy from crying, eyes wide with that familiar mix of desperation and anger. I opened the door only because I didn't want her making a scene in the hallway, and she immediately launched into this frantic speech about how she'd lost everything, how she'd made a mistake, how Matt had turned out to be a liar, and the way she said it was almost comical in its lack of self-awareness, because she was describing Matt the way I'd described her, as if betrayal was suddenly unacceptable now that she was the one being betrayed. She tried to step inside, and I blocked the doorway, and she begged me to talk, and when I told her she needed to leave, she snapped and said, "You're enjoying this," and that accusation hit me like an insult because it revealed how she saw me, as someone who must be vindictive because she couldn't imagine accountability without malice. I told her, slowly and clearly, that I wasn't enjoying anything, that I was rebuilding my life because she destroyed the one we shared, and that her suffering didn't heal me, but it also didn't obligate me to rescue her. She started crying harder and she said, "You were my home, and I remember feeling this ache, because for a second I saw the woman I used to love underneath the mess," but then she followed it immediately with, "Please don't do this to me," and that snapped me back to reality, because I wasn't doing anything to her, I was simply refusing to sacrifice myself to soften the consequences of her actions. I told her the only conversation we were having from that point forward would be through attorneys, and when she refused to move, I told her I would call the police if she didn't leave, and the humiliation on her face was sharp and raw, because she wasn't used to boundaries she couldn't bulldoze. She left, and I closed the door, and I leaned my forehead against the wood and shook for 10 minutes, not because I regretted it, but because severing that final emotional tether felt like cutting a nerve. The divorce finalized just under a year from the day I walked into my bedroom, and by then I had become a version of myself I didn't recognize at first but eventually respected, because I learned how to stay calm while someone tried to provoke me. I learned how to choose silence instead of defending myself to people committed to misunderstanding me, and I learned how to build a life that didn't revolve around trying to keep someone else happy. The settlement wasn't some dramatic victory where Erin walked away with nothing, because real life doesn't work that way, but I kept the house because it made sense financially and because I'd put more into it, and Erin took a payout that let her start over, and the strange part was that signing the final papers didn't feel like triumph, it felt like relief, like I'd been holding my breath for a year and finally exhaled. By the time it was over, Erin's life had narrowed in a way she couldn't hide anymore, because she'd burned through friendships that didn't want the drama. She'd moved into a small apartment with a roommate at 35 because her finances were strained, and she'd taken a lower-paying job outside her old network because her reputation had become a whisper that followed her. Matt, from what I heard, spiraled harder, because he got a DUI after a night out, lost his job not long after, and started bouncing between couches like a guy who couldn't stand still long enough to face the wreckage he created. When I heard those updates, I didn't celebrate, but I also didn't feel responsible, because people love to say, karma, like the universe is keeping score, but the reality is simpler and harsher, which is that bad choices compound, and when you keep choosing selfishness you eventually run out of people willing to catch you. Meanwhile, my life didn't become perfect overnight, but it did become mine again, which was a kind of happiness I'd forgotten existed. I got a promotion at work because I'd thrown myself into projects as a way to stay grounded, and my boss pulled me aside one day and said he'd noticed I'd been steady under pressure, and I almost laughed because if he only knew what my personal life had been like, he'd realize pressure was an understatement. I rebuilt the house slowly, fixed the squeaky floorboard that had betrayed me that day, repainted the bedroom a different color so it didn't feel like a crime scene, and bought new sheets because I couldn't stand the old ones, and those small acts of reclaiming space added up until the house stopped feeling haunted. I also met someone, which I didn't expect and didn't chase, because I wasn't trying to replace Erin like she was an appliance, but life has a way of putting people in your path when you finally stop clinging to what hurt you. Her name was Leah. She was a nurse who came into my life through a mutual friend's barbecue, and she had this grounded, no-nonsense warmth that didn't feel performative. I told her early on that I'd been divorced because of infidelity, not in a dramatic confession way, but in a straightforward honesty way, and she didn't flinch or interrogate, she just said, "That's awful, and I'm glad you got out," and the simplicity of that response almost made me emotional because it didn't try to complicate my boundaries or suggest I owed anyone more chances. We took things slow, and the first time she stayed over, I realized how much betrayal had rewired my nervous system, because my brain kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, and Leah just held my hand and talked to me like I was human, not like I was a problem to manage. The final, everything turns out well for me moment wasn't the promotion or the relationship or even the house, it was this random Tuesday night when I was sitting on my back step with a beer, the same place Erin and I used to drink coffee on Sundays, and I realized I felt peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years, because even before the affair, I'd been living with the subtle tension of trying to keep a marriage afloat while ignoring my own needs. I wasn't bracing for a text, I wasn't replaying the past, I wasn't arguing with a ghost, I was just sitting there listening to the neighborhood sounds, and I thought, with this quiet certainty, that the worst thing that happened to me had also forced me into the best kind of change, because it stripped away illusions and left me with something sturdier. Erin did try one last time to claw at the story, because a few months after the divorce she posted this vague thing on Facebook about surviving a toxic marriage and choosing herself, and I saw it only because someone sent me a screenshot with a furious caption, and for a second my blood boiled because it was so unfair, the way she tried to frame herself as the victim after detonating our life. Then I took a breath, deleted the screenshot, and didn't respond, because that's the final power you get back after betrayal, the power to stop participating in the narrative games, the power to let someone else twist themselves into whatever shape they need to avoid accountability while you keep living in reality. If I have a conclusion that feels true, it's this, and I wish someone had told me sooner, because it would have saved me years of trying to be the good guy at my own expense. When someone cheats, especially with someone close to you, the betrayal is not just a lapse in judgment, it's a statement about their capacity for deception, entitlement, and disrespect, and your job is not to rehabilitate their character at the cost of your sanity. You don't have to scream to have boundaries, you don't have to be cruel to be firm, and you don't have to forgive someone to prove you're mature, because sometimes the most mature thing you can do is accept what someone has shown you and walk away before they convince you to doubt your own eyes. My advice to anyone in the same place I was, standing in the wreckage and wondering if you're overreacting, is to trust what you know, document what you can, lean on people who don't minimize your pain, and remember that the life you're afraid to lose might already be gone, but that doesn't mean your future is, because rebuilding is possible, and sometimes it's not even a consolation prize. It's the first real chance you've had in a long time to live without someone quietly draining you of your dignity.